Okay. Floor is yours, Mike.
All right.
It's all you.
All right, here goes. Thanks for Joe for organizing, and thanks to everybody for listening to what I have to say. So Fichte's theory of money in his little book called The Closed Commercial State, which he published in 1800, is in some ways ahead of its time. The dominant political and economic discourse of Fichte's day held that the stability of the value of money rested on the material value, substantial value of the precious metals from which money was made. And the idea of credit money or representative money, different ways of putting it, had recently taken a major hit with the failure of French assignats to maintain their value against inflationary pressures during the 1790s. So everybody thought that paper currency was a really bad idea. Yet Fichte insists on it. He insists on, in fact, he insists that even the value of gold and silver is not based in the substance of the precious metals, but rather solely in social opinion. And thus, that whether one uses metal currency or paper currency or some other form of money is a matter of more or less arbitrary social convention. Fichte also floats the argument that a state can give value to its paper currency by accepting tax payments only in that currency, creating demand for the currency among its subjects. And this is his idea of if you introduce a non-metal currency, this is how you could give value to it. And these ideas have defenders in the present day. Yet the primary interest of Fichte's account of money lies in his highly unconventional use of the idea of money in his philosophy of European commercial history and his theoretical account of the historical transition to his ideal system of political economy, which he calls the closed commercial state. Recent commentators, two of whom I'll discuss in this talk, have argued first that Fichte's theory of money is foundational to his account of history, and second, that money grounds the Fichtean state in the same way that the eye grounds Fichte's system of transcendental philosophy. Okay, so the closed commercial state was published in 1800. It's divided into 3 books, and I'll use that tripartite structure to frame my talk. Book 1 presents the political economy of the ideally rational state as developed from Fichte's philosophical first principles of right, in abstraction from any specific historical context. Book 2 presents a high-level philosophical reconstruction of the actual commercial history of Europe from the medieval period up to modernity circa 1800. And Book 3 synthesizes the results of books 1 and 2 for politics, which for Fichte is the science of government of the actual state. So this is quote 1 on your handout. For Fichte, the discipline of politics lies halfway between the given state and the rational state. It would describe the continuous path through which the former changes into the latter and will itself terminate in pure right of state. So Book 3 is supposed to describe the course of political action that charts a path from the empirically given social, political, and economic conditions in Book 2 to the ideally rational closed commercial state described in Book 1. Yeah. So Fichte's aims are very ambitious. He wants to show not only that his model of the closed commercial state is required by right and uniquely required by right, but also that it was at least in principle possible to bring such a state into existence under the historical circumstances that existed in Europe around 1800. And he sought to demonstrate this possibility by describing the political means required to close the commercial state. means which he believed to be available under the historical conditions that existed during his time. So in my talk, I'll move through each of the three sections of the text, and I'll try to carefully reconstruct what he says in each section about, first, the economic, second, the historical, and third, the political functions of money. So in contrast with some recent interpretations, I'll argue that Fichte's innovative theory of money is actually not especially central to his account of the past, that is his commercial history, nor does it play a fundamental metaphysical or normative role in his account of the future, in his idealized theory of the closed commercial state. But it is of crucial importance for his program of political action in the present, that is, the program of politics as he understands it. Okay, so first I'll talk about money in Fichte's ideal of the closed commercial state. So some background is necessary in order to understand what money is doing in Fichte's political economy. So I'll just lay out briefly five commitments of Fichte's that are in the background of the account that he's giving of money. So first, Fichte is an actual consent contractualist about political obligation. It's a bit unclear in his account what exactly is supposed to count as consent, but the broad picture is that under social pressure to resolve conflict, people agree to a series of contracts partitioning spheres of coordinated economic activity. This series of contracts adds up with some political enforcement mechanisms added in to what he calls the civil contract. And for Fichte, thus, the negotiation of the traditional social contract is transformed into the negotiation of a mutually agreed scheme of economic production, to which we all actually contract in. Second, Fichte is a Republican and has a Republican ideal of guaranteed social rights. So Fichte holds that as a matter of right, everyone should be guaranteed to be able to live from their labor and to enjoy a roughly equal standard of living. So that means you have to be guaranteed work, and you have to be guaranteed a bundle of basically a wage that is sufficient to live at your accustomed level of social well-being. Yeah. And Fichte also holds a principle that I call conditions, which says if we're going to guarantee you a right, we have to guarantee you any necessary conditions for the realization of that right. Yeah. So that means Fichte holds that the state has to guarantee us a sphere of productive activity, has to guarantee us the required means of production to carry out that activity, and it has to guarantee us the required means of subsistence in order for us to live off that activity. So third, the combination of those first two commitments leads Fichte to propose a model of a planned economy, which is not something you expect to find in 1800, but here it is. It's pretty crude, but nonetheless, the basic intuitions that motivated socialist planned economies, I think, are here. So Fichte holds that to guarantee people's social rights to productive activity and means of subsistence, the social division of labor has to be calculated in advance, given current levels of productivity in different economic sectors. Production targets for agricultural and manufacturing sectors are also to be calculated in advance. He doesn't say much, but he says a little bit about the information problems in making those calculations, but he's mostly wildly optimistic about the state's ability to know what it needs to know. And third, a system of mandatory transfers between sectors is set up in advance to ensure an egalitarian distribution of the social economic product that meets everyone's social rights and material needs. Fourth, this leads Fichte to advocate what he calls commercial closure. So this is where the title of the book comes from. Fichte holds that the state can plan and calculate properly and guarantee people the rights that it's supposed to guarantee, only if free trade between the state's citizens and foreigners is prohibited. So the state is allowed to engage in international commerce, but not individual citizens with a closed commercial state. Lastly, in keeping with his general Republican outlook, Fichte holds that the system of rights and duties and laws and institutions that results from all of this planning and contracting can't be left up to individual goodwill for its enforcement, but rather has to be enforced by means of state coercion. So you're not supposed to rely on other people's goodwill to get the things that you need to get in order to survive. It's supposed to be guaranteed to you. Okay, so that's the background. There's a lot more to say about that, but for now, I think that'll suffice. So let's turn to Fichte's theory of economic value. So the reason that I'm talking about this is because Fichte starts from the question, how should the state establish the fixed prices of things in a state existing in accordance with right? Because of course, in the planned closed commercial state, the state is also supposed to fix prices, secure the value of money. So his strategy for answering the question of how we should price things in the closed commercial state is normative and teleological. He's developing a theory of economic value that the rational state is supposed to use in valuing products of economic activity. It's not a descriptive theory of how commodities are in fact really valued in capitalist economies. It's a theory of that planners are to use in this sort of rational state. In the rational state, planners should fix prices in accordance with the instrumental value of products in achieving the end or ends of the state. And that means planners need a theory of value to do their work. So Fichte starts by declaring what he takes already to have established in his theory of right, namely the end of state economic policy. This is quote 3. In the domain of the doctrine of right, one must assume that the end of all free activity is the possibility and pleasantness of life. He takes this claim already to have been established, and note that there are two ends here, the continuation of life and the pleasantness or the quality of life, and that both of those ends are conditional on one's engaging in a productive activity that is itself defined by the civil contract. For now, Fichte brackets the worry about pleasantness and how to measure that, which in his theory of distributive justice is secondary to the primary end of life itself. So he arrives at the view, and this is quote 4, that the true intrinsic value of the result of every free activity is the possibility of living from it. And the result of this one activity, this thing, will be worth more than another the longer one's able to live from it. The measure of the value of things relative to one another would be the time during which we could live from them. Since the most easily and efficiently produced subsistence good in Fichte's economy is grain, Fichte proposes a grain theory of value. Maybe someone else in the history of economic thought has proposed this, but I'm not aware of it. Perhaps so. This theory holds that the basic measure of value is grain understood as means of subsistence. And then the value of every other commodity is measured in grain equivalents. So for example, for agricultural workers, who produce non-grain agricultural goods for consumption, let's say a cow, the value of their product is measured by adding the subsistence value of the produced good, measured in grain equivalent, to the quantity of grain production that was unrealized due to the less efficient production of non-grain agricultural goods. So, for example, by producing a cow, we choose to forego an additional 2 bushels of grain production compared to what we could have. So the value of non-grain means of subsistence is their value for sustaining life plus their opportunity cost in grain. And that's the way Fichte proposes to measure the value of various kinds of commodities. So there's a lot more to say here. I'm not even sure that the theory is internally consistent. I'm still kind of working out the nuts and bolts of it. But at a high altitude level, the intuitive idea is clear enough. The fundamental economic value for Fichte is the continuation of life. And he gets that from a particular picture of the human being that he's already developed in other work. We therefore start with the simple model of a hypothetical economy that directs all productive resources solely towards efficient production of means of subsistence. And this is the theoretical all-grain economy. And then we imagine step by step redirecting productive resources towards the production of other goods. The reduction in grain production that follows from each such redirection gives us a measure of the value of the non-grain products produced instead. And in principle, then, we can assign everything we produce a grain equivalency. And that's the basic thought of Fichte's theory of value. And before I move on, I'll note a few issues that need further discussion. For one thing, it's not clear to me whether Fichte's use of grain is arbitrary. So you could just as easily imagine, a pure grape economy, a pure kitten economy, and then you just measure the value of other commodities in terms of grape opportunity cost, right? I'm not sure if that's, well, anyway, there might be some responses to that, but I'm not exactly sure. Second, and more importantly, Fichte is committed to the idea, based on what he says in the text, that his closed commercial state would produce an annual social surplus. And thus, that surplus has to arise from the production process itself, because by hypothesis, it can't arise in mercantilist fashion from advantageous trade relations relative to other nations, because we've cut off those relations. Yet the theory of value that he develops doesn't offer an obvious explanation as to how surplus value could arise in the course of production. And my suspicion is that he's actually stuck with something like a physiocratic view, that it's actually nature that's productive here, and not labor, which I think would be something of an awkward result given Fichte's broader metaphysical commitments. But the point is that in comparison with classical political economy more broadly, the issue of the production and distribution of a social surplus is just not a primary aim that he's trying to address using his theory of value. And I think that causes various kinds of problems. Okay, so far I focused on value and not money. And that procedure reflects Fichte's own theoretical priorities. Because after introducing the theory of value that I just discussed, he writes the following. This is quote 5. I've not paid any regard here to money as an artificial basis for measuring all value. For while the theory of money is of no consequence to the propositions we've presented, the latter are of great consequence for the former. So, for Fichte, the theory of economic value is prior to the theory of money, but the theory of money depends on the theory of value. Money is an artificial basis for measuring value, which is to say, I take it, it's a stand-in for grain equivalence values. which then count as the real or the natural measure of value. Now you might ask, well, why introduce money at all, right? If you can do all these calculations without appeal to money prices. And this first argument is just a familiar argument from impracticality. It's not feasible to use grain itself as a means of trade, so we introduce something else. And then he has a second argument, which I've included on the handout as quote 6, but I don't exactly understand it. So if anybody wants to explain it to me, you're more than welcome to do so. So at this point, he turns to talk more about the nature of money itself. So if you look at quote 7, he writes, the more useless this sign, so he's just said money is a sign of value. Yeah. He says the more useless this sign is in and for itself, the less intrinsic value it has, the more fitting it will be to serve as a mere sign, since everything that can be utilized belongs to the nation's intrinsic wealth and should be enjoyed by the nation and not applied to other ends. Money should be manufactured from the material that's least useful. And then quote 8, money in and for itself is nothing at all. Only through the will of the state does it represent something. So money has representational content. Yeah, it has a social meaning. The entire sum of circulating money represents the entire sum of goods found in public commerce. The 10th part of the first, the 10th part of the value of the second. How rich someone is depends not on how many pieces of money he has, but how great a part of all circulating money he possesses. Now, as an account of the circulation of money, this is problematic. And there's stuff about the velocity of circulation and so on. But the basic idea is money represents a share of the entire value of the economy. Right? So according to these passages, money is nothing in itself. Indeed, it should be made from the least useful thing possible, for its material substance is arbitrary, but it represents something. Each token of money represents, or at least is supposed to represent, a fraction of the total annual product of the economy as a whole. The representational content of money, according to this passage, is determined only through the will of the state. How does the state bring it about that money has this specific representational content? The short answer is by fixing money prices through calculation of values, and then enforcing these fixed prices by a law and coercion. So the short answer is money has this representational content because the state enforces that that's what it means, right? So the state, basically state coercion gives a determinate meaning to these signs of value. Fichte views money as a means of exchange that should allow each citizen reliably and foreseeably to obtain the material conditions of existence that have been guaranteed in the set of contracts that founds the closed commercial state. So he's concerned to maintain the buying power of money, and this is how he proposes to do it. It's a blunt instrument, fixing prices and then enforcing. This policy aim fits with Fichte's overall project, for, as I've said, a central purpose of his political economy is to guarantee to all citizens that the material conditions of their existence will be not only available to purchase, but accessible to them at stable, predictable prices. Therefore, necessary quantities of such goods must be guaranteed to be available for purchase, and the money prices of goods are not to be left to the flux of supply and demand, but must be fixed by the state. The money prices fixed by the state aren't arbitrary. but are supposed to reflect the real values of the things produced. So I'd like to draw one intermediate conclusion about this picture. In the story of the rational state that Fichte tells in book 1 of this little text, the ties among citizens are contractual. They concern the mutually agreed production and exchange of specific quantities of goods and services. Money is a convenient way to facilitate these relationships, but economic planning is supposed to be able to take place independently of money, and the exchange of economic products required by the plan could, in principle, take place without money. It's just impractical. So the main point I want to take away from these economic arguments is that you wouldn't look at these arguments and conclude that money is somehow metaphysically or normatively fundamental in Fichte's construction of the closed commercial state. In fact, it's sort of secondary significance. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to book 2. Book 2 is where Fichte stops talking about here's the ideal political economy, and instead he moves to giving a sort of philosophical reconstruction of European commercial history. The account of European commercial history he offers is meant to serve a specific purpose. It's supposed to explain the evolution of commercial and political relations that's culminated in the political and economic situation in Europe circa 1800. And this is meant to be a pragmatic history in the sense that it's meant to orient human action by identifying historical tendencies that are already at work, tendencies which can be directed by human agents toward the ends of reason. Now, Fichte's basic picture of modern European commercial and political history, I find interesting, for in some ways he goes against the grain of better known accounts of commercial history, such as that of Kant. Whereas Kant holds that commerce is in the process of sort of binding the international world together, Fichte holds almost the opposite view, which is that commerce is in the process of de-internationalizing and being consolidated into individual states. Okay. So in his narrative, he says that pre-modern Europe was a condition of both economic and political anarchy. He uses the word anarchy. There were no states in the proper modern sense of the term, and there was no proper political regulation of trade relations. Everyone in what he calls the Great European Commercial Republic, that is the whole continent, was free to exchange whatever they liked with whomever they liked, using world currency, that is gold and silver, as the standard means of exchange. Now, under these conditions, Fichte holds that no one's rights to work, to means of subsistence, or to a decent standard of living could be secure. The progression of early modern European history involves the gradual consolidation of political anarchy into states, thereby removing people from the political state of nature. And there should, according to Fichte, be a corresponding consolidation of national economies under proper juridical control, which removes people from the condition of economic anarchy. And the end point of that latter process, the process of removing people from economic anarchy, is the closed commercial state. So the scholar Curtis Adler, who's actually a translator of the closed commercial state into English, in his interpretive essay, he puts a great deal of weight on the role of money in history for Fichte. And I think, well, all right, so I'm going to criticize Adler, but I do think there's something right about his view as well. So here's what Adler says. This is quote 9. money presents humankind with the choice between, on the one hand, radically affirming the possibility of human freedom by subjecting money itself to an arbitrary determination derived from rational calculation, and thus ultimately bringing money, and with it all human existence, under the sphere of rational control. And on the other hand, continuing to allow human purposes to be foiled by the seemingly uncontrollable sway of opinion. History is thus neither idealist nor materialist, but monetary. So as I understand him, Adler's idea is something like this. For him, Fichte's view of modern European commercial and political history and its trajectories is structured around two different conceptions of money. There's world currency, that's gold and silver, which has been and continues to be the dominant monetary form in the anarchical commerce of the great European commercial republic. And then there's national currency in his specific Fichtean sense, which is a form of representative money, and which Fichte proposes as a replacement for world currency. So at the time that you transition away from the world market and consolidate yourself into a national closed commercial state, you introduce a national currency, right? And that's the big move. Appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, for Fichte, the value of world currency consists in nothing more than what Adler calls infinitely reflected opinion. So for Fichte, gold is valuable only because others are of the opinion that it's valuable, and they're of the opinion that others will be of the opinion that it's valuable, and so on. The value of Fichtean national currency, by contrast, isn't a matter of opinion. At least I take it this is Adler's point. The exchange value of national currency is guaranteed by the closed commercial state through economic planning and enforcement of prices and commercial exchange. And according to Adler, it's only in the latter condition that coordinated goal-directed human agency becomes possible at scale and over historic time. In this way, Fichte flips the usual arguments in favor of precious metal currency on their head. Paper money, or representative money, which represents real value in the closed commercial state, has substantial value because its value is anchored in the real value of commodities for meeting human needs. While gold and silver are subject to the whim of mere opinion. So he says, if you're going to trust a currency, you should actually trust the currency of the closed commercial state, which has a much more solid foundation. This contrast leads Adler to distinguish between two fundamentally different versions of commercial history, one based in world currency and the continuing spectacle of infinitely reflected opinion, the other based in national currency and firmly rooted in human purposiveness and its material conditions. Money is the sign that reveals to us these two possible paths that history can take. A sign which presents us with what Adler calls a fundamental decision regarding which history to inhabit. I want to focus briefly on Adler's claim that history is neither idealist nor materialist, but monetary. I don't think that's right. And so I disagree with Adler about that claim, but I do think there's something right about his view. Idealist and materialist accounts of history are normally understood as offering causal accounts of large-scale epochal historical change in human societies. Well, long story short, I think that Fichte does offer such an account, and I think the account that he offers actually includes in it precisely idealist and materialist elements, right? So it's not as if Fichte is replacing idealist and materialist philosophies of history with something else that relies on money. It's rather that his views about money are doing something, they're doing something different in the account. And to substantiate that claim about his philosophy of history, I've got this nifty little chart. It's in your handout. I'm not going to talk through the entire thing, but in a few pages, Fichte actually gives a quite interesting account of what he views as the evolutionary stages that European commerce and European politics has gone through since the Middle Ages. And the only thing that I'll note here is that as we move regarding political structure, social conditions, trade relations, and economic life, as we move from the medieval period through early modernity up to the present circa 1800 and into the closed commercial state, in each one of these domains, you'll see that the tendency is away from relations of arbitrary subjection and towards relations of rationally mediated and norm-governed agency. So he views that gradual process of rationalization as taking place with regard to political structure, with regard to religion, with regard to trade, with regard to economic life, the consolidation into defined states and the rationalization of life in those states. But he thinks that that process is the political structure has actually gotten out in front of the economic structure, right? Very un-Marxist thing to say. So he thinks that states are farther along in the process of political consolidation and rationalization than they are in the process of economic consolidation and rationalization. Yeah. So money is playing a role here for sure. So he talks about money as a means of exchange that you use in the great European commercial republic, gold and silver, and he talks about how you've got to replace that with something else in order to help this process along. But it's not like it's not like money or monetary relations are somehow driving the whole process, right? There's a whole series, there's a variety of different social forces at work. So I don't think that Adler is right to view Fichtean history as distinctively monetary. But what I suspect motivates Adler is his intuition that Fichte's philosophical outlook is close to existentialism, close to the idea that, well, for those of you who are not familiar with Fichte, he has this idea, calls it the self-positing eye, the eye that thinks itself and thereby that reflects on itself and thereby constitutes itself as an epistemic and practical agent. So the eye just sort of posits itself into existence, right? It's quite existentialist idea. And Adler thinks that Fichte's view of the historical choice between an anarchical economy based in world currency and a closed economy, rational economy based in national currency is something like the existential choice of positing different political futures. And I think there's something to that intuition, which is developed in greater detail by another commentator I'll talk about in a minute, a guy called Richard Gray. All right, so that's book 2. I'm going to conclude with the discussion of book 3, in which Fichte presents his politics. How am I doing on time? I don't know when I started. Have I gone about 30 minutes? 30, 35. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm okay. So I've just argued that money is not central to Fichte's account of European commercial history, but I've also signaled my agreement with Adler's intuition that Fichte regards the transformation of monetary relations as a decisive historical intervention. It's an act of freedom in history. And the most significant role for money in the closed commercial state is as the primary means for achieving commercial closure and thereby transforming commercial relations and securing individuals' socioeconomic rights. Control over monetary policy gives actually existing states the capacity to take a decisive step toward Fichte's rational state. The human capacity to transform and restructure and reconceive monetary relations gives us a unique kind of practical power for transforming society. So Fichte gives us advice on political advice on how to go about the business of closing the commercial state. And this is his politics in his technical sense. The argument's fairly straightforward, and it focuses centrally on money. So the main way that you get from economic anarchy to a rational political economy is through what I'll call like a monetary transition. Yeah. So here's what he says. This is quotes 10 through 12. What's demanded is the complete elimination of all direct commerce between the citizen and any foreigner. It must be rendered completely impossible. The possibility of world trade rests on our possessing the means of exchange valid in all the world and being able to put this to use. The foreigner will not sell to someone who doesn't possess gold or silver money. So the solution of our task is as follows. All the world currency that's found in the hands of the citizens, that is all gold and all silver, should be brought out of circulation and converted into a new national currency. A money, this is to say, that would be valid and exclusively valid only in the one country. So in Fichte's historical context, this is a radical transformation, right? Because there's all these competing metal currencies that are circulating, right? So to take all of those out of circulation and replace them with one fiat currency would be a huge change. So how should the government accomplish this? Well, it's not exactly clear. All citizens are supposed to be compelled by law to exchange their gold and silver for national currency. So there's sort of a currency buyback, right? The state announces that it will only accept tax payments in the new currency, thereby creating demand. And the state will introduce a schedule of money prices for goods in the new currency. And individuals will thus need the currency in order to get what they need to live. So these policies are all to be introduced, according to Fichte, excuse me, in one fell swoop. And he even goes so far as to advise the government to keep the whole plan a secret before implementing it. All right, so what do we make of all this? Well, Fichte's proposal here is historically specific. The state seizure of gold and silver currency would be sufficient to cut off international trade only under very specific historical conditions, which may be held true in 1800, but actually I doubt it. I think there would almost immediately be there'd be currency markets, and there would be a continuation. Just changing the currency by itself wouldn't do the job, right, of cutting off international trade. So Fichte's idea that the currency transition would by itself suffice is to achieve commercial closure is probably a fiction, but let's just leave that aside. If this intervention were carried out in one country, Fichte holds that it would initiate a whole cascade of other monetary transitions, and he reasons as follows. The newly closed commercial state would suddenly come into possession of a large amount of world currency, which it would also suddenly have no need for internally, but which would still be very much in demand in the world market. So it suddenly become very rich in relation to other states, and it's supposed to use its new power to consolidate its position in the world via the threat of military force if necessary. Most importantly, the state is supposed to import from abroad any productive technologies and also encourage immigration using its newfound riches to sort of bribe people to come into the closed commercial state. So it's supposed to use its riches to get the technology and human capital it needs to achieve internal economic self-sufficiency. And in Fichte's view, the state that goes first will be able to buy up the world's best technology and talent. And whichever state goes first gets the biggest advantage. For with each state that transitions away from world currency, the supply of world currency on the international market grows and the demand falls. So the last state to transition, to undergo the monetary transition gets no benefit relative to its peers. Once one state moves away from world currency, other states will see the advantages and will themselves make the same move. So the decision to make this monetary transition, in Fichte's view, has potentially enormous social, political, and economic consequences. It sets in motion the completion of what he sees as ongoing historical processes of economic rationalization, state consolidation, and political autonomy. So his theory of money acts as a powerful causal lever that's available in the present to intervene in history and accelerate the processes already at work. It's not a view about the past, nor is it a prediction about what money will mean in the closed commercial state of the future. It's a view about an intervention that's available at a very specific place in history. So Richard Gray has written this very good book. It's called Money Matters, and it's about culture and economics and money in Germany between like 1770 and 1850. And in his, he writes about the closed commercial state, and he says there's an analogy in Fichte between the role of money in his political economy and the role of the self-positing eye in his transcendental philosophy. So this is quote 14. The self-grounding or a priori nature of the ego is fundamental to the structure of Fichte's system. It generates the transcendental system of knowledge as a closed but stable conglomerate of valid interrelationships among the logical propositions of knowledge. And the structural constitution is exactly replicated in the closed economic system of Fichte's Der geschlossene Handelsstaat. However, here the grounding transcendental principle is not the I, but instead the famous first proposition of Fichte's 1794 Wissenschaftslehre, I equals I. But instead the claim that money equals money. Or to put it another way, money's valid because it's money. And because this monetary principle is valid, all the economic exchanges within this system are also valid and constitute a closed, internally coherent system. So the thought here is that just as the I's positing of itself is the constitutive bootstrapping act that grounds human cognition and volition as a systematic and autonomous whole, so the self-positing of national currency grounds the state as a systematic autonomous totality. And to make this work, Gray suggests, and he has textual evidence, that money for Fichte, like the I, has internal structure. You can differentiate between different moments of the money is a relation, basically, between an idea and a concrete material reality, and the idea is realized through the material reality. Right? So on the basis of this metaphysical picture, Gray attributes to Fichte a political view that he describes as monetary nationalism. And that's the view that national community is constituted and sustained by the symbolic and material ties of a shared national currency. Gray gives the example of the role of the Deutschmark in the post-war reconstruction of West Germany. So there's this phrase, D-Mark nationalism, is a thing that people talked about. So this is partially right, I think, and the appeal of the analogy is obvious. The rationalized modern state posits itself into existence through the free act of instituting a radical monetary policy, and it captures very clearly the intuition that I suggested motivated Adler as well. A new kind of money allows for a new kind of autonomous activity. But I think Gray's argument confuses historical founding with metaphysical and normative grounding. And that's a confusion that Fichte himself invites at certain points. So I'll conclude by trying to explain what I mean. Gray rightly notes, well, there's one small point, I'll skip it though. The main point here. Gray rightly notes that in Fichte's transcendental philosophy, the eye's self-positing activity is the ground, the transcendental first principle upon which the entire edifice is built. It's also, incidentally, the telos, the endpoint towards which all of our striving as finite agents is directed. Fichte, in his systematic philosophy, starts with the eye's self-positing activity, and then derives layer upon layer of conditions and norms and relations from this basic activity. Now, national currency, money in closed commercial state, plays a crucial role in initiating the closure of the commercial state. But is it the ground from which the entire edifice is derived? Well, no. Fichte offers no derivation procedure that starts with the positing of national currency and then seeks to justify further norms or institutions as conditions of its possibility. Indeed, as we saw in the discussion of Book 1, the role of money in Fichte's ideally rational state is actually decidedly secondary. Money only comes into the picture as a policy tool after the civil contract has been agreed and the economy has been organized and planned. Thus, Fichte has a decisive role for money as a uniquely powerful tool in his doctrine of politics, but a merely secondary role for money in his philosophical doctrine of the necessary structural features and normative justification of the rightful state. If we're looking for a ground of the rightful state, a more plausible candidate would be Fichte's concept of the individual eye, the finite eye that knows itself as one eye situated in a shared material and social space with others. It's this concept with which he begins his earlier text, Foundations of Natural Right, and the closed commercial state is supposed to be a continuation of that argument that he starts there. Every part of Fichte's system of right, including his political economy, is supposed to be a condition of the possibility of the full actualization of individual agency. To realize Fichte's system of right at a certain point in history does require the state to institute a radical new monetary policy, but that policy doesn't ground the new system. I think if we're looking for an analog in Fichte's transcendental philosophy for the founding of the closed commercial state through the introduction of national currency, a better analogy might be either Fichte's doctrine of the summons, the idea of, well, I'll say a little more about that, or perhaps his doctrine of the Anstoß, sort of check, an external check on one's agency. So according to a famous argument of Fichte's, a summons, eine Aufforderung, from another agent is necessary for an agent originally to posit itself as an individual free efficacy. That is, as a discrete cause of effects in a shared material and social space inhabited by other agents. The summoner expressly limits her agency to make room for the summoned to act, and in so doing defines a sphere of free activity for the summoned agent. It's then up to the one summoned to respond to the summoner by acting within the defined sphere or not, and to reciprocally recognize the summoner as entitled to their own sphere of free activity as well, or not. The summons does not by itself posit the summoned as an agent, doesn't constitute the agent summoned. It allows the summoned agent to posit itself as an agent. It's a condition, it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. So the analogy here would be as follows. The summons is a necessary condition for the inauguration of a new form of agency, and it defines a sphere within which this new form of agency is supposed to actualize itself. Fichte's state situated in history corresponds to the summoner, and the citizens are summoned by the state to constitute themselves as a self-sustaining whole. The state's move to replace world currency with national currency defines the boundaries of this new political economic entity's possible activity. That is, it defines the sphere of the closed commercial state as a totality. But despite Fichte's suggestion that the state could constitute itself as a legitimate, planned, closed commercial state just by the act of currency transition, if we take his account in Foundations of Natural Right and Book 1 of the Closed Commercial State seriously, I think the introduction of national currency could at best prompt the citizens to reconstitute themselves, to posit themselves as something new. Fichte suggests in some of those passages we looked at in Book 3 that the work of economic planning, division of labor, and so on, that is the work that constitutes and legitimizes the closed commercial state, could somehow all be accomplished by government officials in advance of the currency transition, and that the new framework could simply be imposed on an unsuspecting populace. But in Fichte's account of right, the work of negotiating and defining the contractual relationships that define the social contract is the work of human beings positing themselves as individual agents. The monetary transition described by Fichte in Book 3 may be historically necessary in his account to open up space for individuals to define or to reconstitute the relations to each other, but only the individuals who together constitute this new entity can ground it by positing it as a new and legitimate form of association. The currency transition Fichte describes as a unique intervention in the course of history, just as the summons is a unique event or series of events in the history of an individual human agent, but it can't by itself do the normative and constructive work assigned to it by Gray's interpretation.
You had your hand up slightly before I did, so you go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. This was very interesting. I have two, hopefully two short questions.
Yeah.
So in the very beginning of the text, you said, or of the presentation, you said, so the idea why we have the closed commercial state is that no one should rely on other people's goodwill. And what I find interesting about this is I see the sort of the normative argument that's made here with certain rights, and so we can't make sort of certain claims, the fulfillment of certain claims contingent upon sort of what's happening. But the interesting thing is that Adam Smith makes exactly the same argument with a totally different conclusion, right? The quote, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, or the brewer. If I understand that quote correctly, it means that that's the wonderful thing about commercial society. We don't have to beg for stuff. We can just produce stuff and then exchange it. So we don't rely on their goodwill, but we can rely on their egoism. Yeah. So that's just an interesting sort of, because they're historically so close together. I just found it interesting that they also different conclusions. So then another very short question. So I'm always a little sort of taken aback by, there are these great thinkers, and then they find the structure of subjectivity, something like this, and then here you find sort of, I guess the argument in Fichte is if you can posit yourself, or if you can understand yourself as an I, you're conceptually required to recognize others. So the way I read it, it's a conceptual argument for claims of others that you're committed to by being a subject. And I don't really buy into I guess I have the same skepticism that you have, maybe with a different take on it. I don't buy into the translation of this structure that makes sense in very specific places, like in Hegel, with negativity applied to itself, and then it's something, and then it's always extended to, the most concrete things. Oh, a family, it must be father, mother, child, because, the one is the individual, the other one is the general, and so forth. And here the problem I have is with the descriptions that you brought, it's always sort of, there are causal mechanisms that show why money would be needed in a state, but there's no conditional mechanism. So there's nothing that has like the conceptual force of the argument that is made in the structure of subjectivity, where sort of this method is applied to show what we're committed to. Whereas in the case of money, it's just a contingent thing that fulfills a certain purpose, but I think it's far away from being comparable to the fundamental position that that the I has in the structure of the argument there. So I would doubt it on these grounds. So maybe it's contingently useful, but it's not a conceptual matter.
Yeah, that's great. So first, on the first point about Smith, I suppose I should. So I think Fichte would think that even relying on the problem really is that butcher and baker have the right to arbitrarily do what they want with what's theirs.
Yeah.
That for Fichte is the problem. And that's why we can't rely on them. So like maybe the butcher just doesn't like me.
Yeah.
Right? And he said, I'm just not going to sell to you, right? That's the kind of concern, like Fichte holds that, like, even if another person has an interest, right, in doing what I want them to do, that's not a guarantee, right? Because people have, people act against their interests all the time. They have arbitrary reasons for doing all sorts of things, right? And he is a very Republican thinker. So for him, even if I have reason to think you'll do what I want you to do, if I depend on your arbitrary choice, then you still dominate me, right? I mean, that's a relation of unfreedom for him. Now, I'm sort of, well, yeah, okay, so we'll leave that there. The second point about different forms of necessity, I mean, I take it. I think you're right, and I worry about this myself. I mean, so it's one thing to say that that this monetary transition is maybe causally necessary at a certain point in history to sort of redirect history in the direction that Fichte wants it to go, right? That's one kind of claim. But that's not a claim about, I mean, the summons is supposed to be, an a priori condition of possibility of awareness of oneself as a certain kind of agent, right? And that's a different kind of necessity, right? That's a kind of, as you said, conceptual necessity. I mean, a different way to put the same point, and this is the way I worried about it, is you could say, well, the monetary transition itself might not even be necessary. I mean, it's not conceptually necessary. You can just imagine, like, hey, everybody in France reads the closed commercial state and becomes convinced that this is what they should do. And then they just do it. They voluntarily do it, right? And the state doesn't have to, summon the people to reconstitute themselves through a currency transition at all, right? So it seems that it's empirically contingent in that way. And I mean, basically, I just want to grant to grant the point and say like, it's not a perfect analogy. I do think, what I'm trying to do is I think that there is supposed to be some analogy here between the structure of the political and economic entity that comes into being and the structure of subjectivity. And I'm just I'm sort of like trying to like figure out how to map the one onto the other, right? And I thought the way Gray and Adler did it wasn't quite right. And I tried a different model. Maybe it doesn't work either. But there's got to be something. That's my suspicion.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, so I don't know, I mean, if we're splitting this right down the middle, Frank, pretty close here, but I just wanted to ask real quick, and maybe this is not something for you to answer here, but just to think about for the purposes of the paper. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, right? As there often is with the philosophers writing in this time and place. But so I'm curious, what problem is this meant to solve? What problem? Who is Fichte's? I hate the audience question, but who is Fichte's audience? Who is he addressing here? What's going on in the Holy Roman Empire or in Prussia at the time that this is meant to be a solution to, right? So again, you don't necessarily have to answer that now, but it might be something in the paper just to help your audience kind of like situate themselves in the relevant historical context to kind of understand who he's addressing.
Yeah, that's good. So Fichte, at least in the 1790s, and I think continuing into this text, he has Jacobin sympathies. So by 1793, the Jacobins are proposing a new version of the French Constitution that contains not just classical liberal rights to things like private property and freedom of association, but also material right, social rights to things like subsistence goods, right? And I think he thinks that that's right, and he's trying to he's trying to do several things at once. He's trying to philosophically justify the idea that those rights are legitimate natural legitimate natural rights that should be enfranchised in the Constitution, right? And he's trying to propose the outlines of a program that he thinks could actually guarantee them. Because nobody really knew. I mean, this is still to some degree the problem with social rights is like it's easy to write them into the Constitution. Right. It's hard to figure out how to actually make it work. And I mean, his idea definitely wouldn't have worked. I mean, I'm not like,
sure, of course,
not like defending the idea, right? But that's the world that he's looking at and the perspective that he's looking at it from. So he's looking at the problems that he's trying to solve are like, bread riots. Mm-hmm. From his point of view in history, every time France tried to institute a free market in grain, there were shortages and bread riots, and they had to go back to fixing prices. Yeah, and the Necker stuff. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the history that he's looking at. So he's just saying like, well, that's not going to work. So let's figure out a plan where we can actually.
I think that's very interesting, right? Because I mean, part of what you're talking, I mean, the way that you explain it is that this is a German or a Prussian looking at the French Revolution, right?
Oh yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, and that's the context in which he thinks the menu of, he has a particular menu of solutions on the table.